Okay, good morning. Just a little bit over 4:20 right now on a Thursday, actually Wednesday morning. And the title of my poster board is The Chicana Movement, Parallels and Contrasts to a Traditional White Woman's Rights Agenda. Okay, I'm first going to start off with a quote by Mirta Vidal, Chicana activist, feminist, and this is what she defines the Chicana and how she defines the Chicana. The Chicana is a Mexican-American female who is raised in the United States. La Chicana has minority status in her own land, even though she is in part indigenous to the Americas and a member of one of the largest majority ethnic groups in the United States. She's a woman whose life is too often characterized by the poverty, racism, and sexism, not only in the dominant culture, but also within her culture. And that's where we're going to dive into that. It's a double-edged sword for Chicanas. At least that's the argument that they have. And, we're going to start off with some of the demands that the Chicana has. Some of the demands that they have are challenging the status quo that perpetuates among a white patriarchal society and also a Chicano or Mexicano patriarchal and cultural society. White men, brown men, and culture are all contributors to the oppression of Chicanas and what they have endured. Job inequality and domestic expectations are some of the few social and cultural fetters Chicanas are fighting against. They also question the machismo, the discrimination in education, the double standard, the role of the Catholic Church, and all the backward ideologies designed to keep women subjugated. They also demand a free legal abortion and birth control for the Chicano community, controlled exclusively by Chicanas. Vidal also states that we have the right to control our bodies, and I'll comment more on that as we go. And then one of the last things is the resolution also called for a 24 child care center in Chicano communities and explained that there is a critical need for these since Chicana motherhood should not preclude educational, political, social, and economic advancement. Now, just a little bit of background and history and kind of like a timeline in regards to the Chicana movement, which parallels with the Chicano movement and the civil rights movement, and you cannot have the Chicana movement without all these other elements added to it. The first one that I thought about was the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846. A lot of people don't go as back as that, but that's a crucial point in U.S.-Mexican relations and the discrimination that Mexicanos and Mexicanas or Chicanas have faced. Now, obviously, the Treaty of Guadalupe was also a big factor in everything that has happened to the Chicana in the United States. You have the revolution of between 1910 and 1914, the Mexican Revolution, which forces a lot of Mexicanos across the border as refugees. Now, another element that a lot of people do not talk about, but it is very important, is the demand for cheap labor. And as we know, those of you that love history, America is a big fan of cheap labor or slavery. Since the inception of this country, with slavery, you have nearly 300 years of slavery here in the Americas, which benefits the white man. After the after the abolitionists succeed and the slaves are freed, you still have other forms of slavery. So cheap labor in the American Midwest and Southwest were some crucial aspects and elements. During World War I, the war required many whites to fight abroad. Therefore, laborers were needed to fill in the spots whites were vacating. And as Carlos Munoz Jr. mentioned in his journal article, quote, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were needed in the expansion and development of the steel industry in Chicago and Pittsburgh, and in agriculture and the Southwest economy in general. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, that for the Chicana, it's not only the struggles that they face against the patriarchal white man or the patriarchal white society. They also have the domestic battle. So regardless of the cheap labor that was needed in the United States, Anglos did not welcome them to the country whatsoever. That's another dimension that needs to be added, is that in contrast to what white women were going through, the white women were in this country when the white man was gaining independence from England. Even though the white women did not have the rights and the privileges that the white man had, but they were part of that society, that white society. They were not excluded because of the color of their skin, and that's the difference between the Chicana. The Anglo settlers did not greet the Mexican newcomers with open arms, but instead saw them as outsiders who could be exploited on the labor market, which still happens today. Mexican women had a two-edged discrimination battle to endure and face. Traditional and cultural Mexican demands required them to remain sexually pure. And this is going back to the historical traditions of Mexican and Mexico, where the men demanded that their women stay chaste and pure and virgin. And I believe in the class some of you mentioned in regards to that. Sexually pure to remain under the control of Mexican man authority, and much of the authority was lost if the Mexican woman worked. So a lot has to do with economics too. When America was demanding cheap labor, women also partook in that. They took up on that challenge and that opportunity. And with that, came domestic, conflict with the Mexican woman and the man. The belief was that Mexican men lost control of their women when the woman worked outside the house. That's why I don't let my wife work. So, nah, just kidding. Now, this is interesting because there's a dichotomy and there has always been, I believe, between the white woman's civil rights agenda and a woman of color. Now, here it says that in 1936, U.S. Women's Bureau study that Mexican women made $5.85 a week as compared to a white woman's wage, which was $8.75. So color does have a lot to do with it. So when it comes to civil rights and it comes to women's rights and feminism, there has to be some kind of separation to some extent. Although, as we know with every movement, even with the Chicanos and the blacks, there were good white people that understood the plight of the brown people, of the people of color, and they joined along with that. Okay, so adapt. My next slide goes into adapt, accept, and infiltrate. And we talked about infiltrating the system, infiltrating the white system, the patriarchal white system, with whiteness being the standard in the United States. And not only whiteness, but the white man's traditional ways. Not only did the white woman have to adapt, mimic, and infiltrate the white man's strategies, but so did the Chicana. As stated in the following quote, Chicanas had to adapt to the white man's and woman's ways of advancements. Quote, they began to adapt Anglo progress in terms of women's rights. As some Mexican women slowly adopted modern customs such as smaller families, two working parents, and especially birth control, Mexicanas made great social progress. Now, let me give you a little bit of background in regards to the Chicana and the Chicano movement, because like I said, you cannot talk about the Chicana movement without talking about the Chicano movement. But the Chicanas try to separate themselves from that because they believe that they have a more profound struggle, and which they probably do. In the 1940s, Mexican-American civil rights movement challenged the American stereotypes it had about people of Mexican ancestry. The Chicana, its origins was established during the 1960s, going back to the civil rights movements, and the name was coined by the Mexican-American woman who wanted to establish social, cultural, and political identities for themselves in America. And in the 1960s, you have El Movimiento, or the Chicano movement. That's when it begins. That's the roots of it, some of the roots. And in 1962, you have a famous Chicana who helped spearhead the United Farm Workers Association. Her name is Dolores Huerta. A lot of you are familiar with her. And so you do have women that are helping out, and women who are partaking in that. Now, just to kind of parallel and see some of the contrast and compare and contrast some of the movements and the actions of white women and Chicanas, I'm going to give you a little bit of history to the white women's rights as well. In 1769, an English system is implemented within the colonies regarding property and ownership that states that women cannot own property in their own name or keep their own earnings. And obviously, from the get-go, men were in control of women. Women were property. When they married, everything belonged. Not only did they belong to the white man, but everything else belonged. Whether it was slaves that they had, money, possessions, any kind of possessions, the white man owned. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting, and where the white woman starts to mimic what the white man has done in order for her to free herself. In 1848, you have in Seneca Falls, New York, over 300 white women activists congregate and strategize as they attempt to attain voting rights. And you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott that signed the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. Now here, you have the women taking a page out of the white man's Declaration of Independence on England. Now, this is the way the white man's Declaration of Independence reads. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What is interesting here is that they don't mention men of color, they don't mention women, or women of color. They exclude. It's exclusively for, it seems, white men. Now women, taking a page from the Declaration of Independence, have the Declaration of Sentiments. Women rewrite it, and they put, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." But what is interesting here too is that they exclude people of color. And I think that every time that people are fighting for any form of civil rights or equality, they, along the lines, they exclude other people, which is, I guess, normal to some extent. Is it right? Is it correct? Maybe not. But just wanted you to kind of see that the white women did see how the white man declared their independence, and how they were excluded, and how they should have been included. So they're throwing back their own words at the white man, at the hypocrisy of that. And then in 1868, you have the National Labor Union. This union pushed for equal pay for equal work, primarily with the idea that women should get paid for the work that they do, and which is still a struggle today, because women still don't get paid the same amount as men do. The white woman's rights timeline. Just one 1869. Racial equality issues split two suffrage associations. Now here's where you have a group of white women who bicker over some of the rights that African or black men are getting. The Civil War amendments, which include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, causes conflict between the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Suffrage Association. As we know, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th gave African Americans or blacks citizenship. And the 15th Amendment allowed men to vote. And that was a big issue with the National Women's Suffrage Association or movement. They condemned the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Unless they were changed to include women and men, could not be full members of unless they were changed to include women, and men could not be full members, although they could be affiliated. So they wanted women to be included into these amendments, and they said if women cannot be included, well, hey, we don't want these men to get these rights, which I believe is kind of backward. I believe that anytime that there's some kind of progress, regardless of color, gender, race, or whatever, we need to move on it. Obviously, there are exceptions, but we'll talk more about that. So I'm going to keep going with this. Now, my next slide is entitled Skin, Perceived Roles, and Gender. Continuing with the timeline, in 1869, Wyoming Territory gives women the right to vote, and it's only women over the age of 21. In 1872, Congress requires federal equal pay for equal work. Once again, legislation getting involved, but is it happening? Is legislation holding these rules or laws and these men accountable? And then Susan B. Anthony, famous feminist, was arrested for attempting to vote. As we know, voting for women came until 1920. In 1896, National Association of Colored Women organized. And here's where you have to see the difference between a woman of color and a white woman. If blacks, Chicanas, if they have to organize among themselves, that's because there's a deeper, more profound issue that's happening with them. Over 100 African American women unite to promote equality for women and to end segregation. You see, that's the difference. Whites were not being segregated. White men, white women were not being segregated. It was women of color, men of color. Also, people of color were experiencing violence. So white women were not experiencing violence. If anything, it was domestic violence from their abusive white husbands. And in 1935, Mary McLeod Bethune, she organizes a group of black women in hopes to influence against job discrimination, racism, and sexism. So the key word right here is racism. Is people, the women are fighting against that. And I just want to end this presentation, my poster presentation, with this quote by Mirta Vidal, which kind of, I guess as Dr. Rosato would say, here's the punchline. And this is my overall message. And the quote reads this way: "The oppression suffered by Chicanas is different from that suffered by most women," which they're talking most likely about white women in this country, and probably blacks too, because Chicanas are part of an oppressed nationality. They are subjected to the racism practiced against La Raza. Since the overwhelming majority of Chicanos are workers, Chicanas are also victims of the exploitation of the working class. But in addition, Chicanas, along with the rest of women, are relegated to an inferior position because of their sex. Thus, Raza women suffer a triple form of oppression. They suffer as members of an oppressed nationality, as workers, and as women. That was by Vidal in 1971. So, you see a lot of parallels between white women and Chicanas. They had to organize. They want the same rights. The rights to their body, economic. They don't want to be oppressed by men. Okay, but so those are the things. But you do see the contrast. You see the differences that Chicanas have to fight, and white women don't have to worry about, like segregation, discrimination based on race, equal pay. They still have to fight for that, but there's, white women were getting paid more than Chicanas. So when you're a woman and a woman of color, it's a kind of like a two-strike right there. You're a female and you're a female of color, and you have to work twice as hard. So that's my presentation. I hope you guys like it. 4:43. I'm checking out.